What was the best you have no power here moment you have ever seen? I used to work for a super cunty manager when I worked at McDonald's. This guy was horrible to us. He was constantly bullying us, shit talking us to customers, and doing everything in his power to make us miserable. Well, so many people complained about him that he ended up getting fired. New manager was great. He was super chill and understanding with us all. A couple weeks after he took over, the old doucher bag comes in and starts talking about how terrible the store looks, how our service is shittier than ever, and how much this store needs him. The new manager looked at him and said, if you don't leave, then the cops are gonna make you. When the doucher bag didn't move, new awesome manager stuck to his guns and called the cops. The doucher bag is no longer allowed on any McDonald's property in the city and has a restraining order against him. You know he's a doucher bag because he came back to where he got fired from. The first time I had dinner at my parents' house after I got my own apartment. My dad was giving me grief as usual. Finally, I stood up and said, I don't live here anymore. I don't have to put up with you this way any longer. I'm going home. And walked out. Most liberating moment of my life. I told my ex I was getting remarried. He told me he was going to stop me and put a lien on my house, which I bought with my money 6 years after the divorce. My son would come home from visitations telling me how his dad was going to stop the wedding and I'd have to pay him all of this money, la-dee-da. Get to court. His attorney goes blah 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 for what felt like forever. My lawyer, yes, I had to freaking get one, stands up and simply hands the judge the divorce papers showing the disbursement of funds and how my ex isn't owed anything. Judge looks at ex's lawyer and basically asks, did you even ask for this document before filing, and dismisses the case. Not me, but a story my dad used to tell me all the time. So my biological grandmother was very emotionally abusive. She was very controlling and tried to keep people within her sphere of influence. There's a reason why my grandfather divorced her. In high school my dad had a job washing airplanes at an airport in our area, which he absolutely loved. He's a huge fan of aircraft in general. He had classes until roughly 10 AM and then he'd be off to work until around 10 PM. It was what he loved. He didn't mind long hours being around aircraft all day. But one day he came home a little too late for his mom's liking. She said she'd take his keys to his motorcycle and that he'd lost privileges to it. The fact of the matter is that he bought the motorcycle himself and he needed it to get to school as well as work. He laughed in her face and she didn't do anything. She couldn't do anything. Ex and I were moving out after a breakup, cleaning out garage. She was being critical of my post-breakup plan of moving in with a car walker until I could find a better place to live, as most options weren't great. I took a deep breath and laughed. This puzzled her. Why are you laughing? She asked. I collected myself and said, because this is the last time I have to listen to this. You don't get to be critical of anything I ever do, ever again. It was a really great feeling, because I literally thought of the you have no power here as I laughed. I'm a high school teacher who teaches a lot of senior grades, and so has to deal with graduation grades, references for university, all that jazz. I had a parent of a graduating kid in my classroom in June, after final marks were given to students, but not formally reported, who was a dental surgeon in town. Ran a large operation, donated a lot to local sports, big man in a small town. I had given his kid a mark in the high B range, and so he marched into my office and started off with the "there must be some mistake" line, which moved swiftly into the "you're going to change it, because I tell you to how much will it cost to get him there." When I refused the bribe he went to "you're fired!" exclamation point exclamation point exclamation point 1 exclamation point 1 exclamation point quote. Not "I'm going to get you fired" but "you're fired, clean out your desk." I just asked him to leave. Ended badly. He threatened violence. I reported him to the school admin. He's now banned from the property. Mr. I pay your salary, so you work for me, you lousy piece of s***. It was threatened with the cops by Mr. Random Act PG. My boss calling me at 7 AM on a Saturday to ask if I could lay some flooring for a friend of his at nearly half my normal rate. Yeah, hard pass Andy. I was waiting for a friend to finish work. She worked at a restaurant so fancy they had someone vetting guests at a podium outside. The place was glitzy and the folks were glam, so the great and good would descend in droves. Those with a reservation were sent in. Prospective walk-ins had to queue. A car sweeps up, the driver jumps out and holds the door open to unleash a hat and dress. The woman accompanying said finery, a C-list actress from a regional daytime TV show, looked through everyone present and moved to enter. She froze, appalled, when the guest vetter intercepted, asking, "Do you have a reservation?" She mustn't have heard the question, because she didn't respond. Instead, she drew herself up to the full height of her couture and demanded, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," said the maitre d', back of the queue. Oof. Woman complained we wouldn't fill her clearly fraudulent C2 prescription, brought the brand new store manager back to the pharmacy to make us fill it. She says you have to fill it. God himself cannot make us fill anything if it fails the checks. No. I grew up with my parents having screaming arguments over every little thing. They do love each other. Over 50 years of marriage so far testifies to that, and it always upset me. A couple of days ago, they popped into my house to visit for a coffee on their way to stay with friends a few miles away. Within minutes, they were yelling at each other. I took great pleasure in telling them that I would not stand for such behavior in my house, and if they didn't lower their voices, they could stand outside until they learned some manners. The meek apologies tasted so sweet, as did the coffee. I once had a boss try to give me a disciplinary, 3 months later I may add, for my behavior, as it was noted I was rude to her by several of the group's CEOs in a board meeting. On the disciplinary forms, you both have to write your version of the events, and it goes to hours for an adjudication. She did her part and I casually filled in something to the effect of, "Manager continually pressured me into deleting files from our client management system prior to a regulatory audit, which is against the ethical code of our profession and not aligned with my moral standards." I accept I was short with her, but she was trying to force me into performing an illegal activity. I watched her collect up the paper and the color drained from her face. I never did hear from hours. She got fired not long after, when I casually mentioned to the CEO in a bar if she remembered the encounter, and explained why I may have appeared a little frustrated and upset. By Felicia. The guy that I'd gone on a few dates with introduced me to his parents. Things went well, or so I thought. He drives me home. We end up talking and drinking a few beers. I didn't want him on the road with any alcohol in his system, and I enjoyed his company, so we end up hanging out until 3 AM. His mom starts blowing up his phone, demanding that he comes home, so he drives himself home to find that he's been locked out of his house. His mom said that he can sleep outside. He shouldn't be spending time with someone like me. Still don't know what she meant by that, and that I'm just another stop on the pussy train. He tells her not to talk about me like that, to which she says, "When you're under my roof, I'll say whatever I want about whoever I want." So he picks up his phone, calls me, asks if he can stay at my place for a little while. It's been 7 years, we are engaged, have a dog, a cat, and a happy life. I also plan on throwing some subtle train themes into the wedding/celebration after the end of the plague. Some secretary of some branch of a state agency would go on a power trip and stamp "Do not copy" on things that she sent to local agencies. Well, I work for an oversight agency and I needed a copy. Locals were terrified, so I rolled my eyes and called to explain that the locals and I were basically the same entity. Woman started to have a conniption fit, but she got real quiet when I cut her off and said, "Fine, I'll issue a subpoena. What's your name and job title?" She answered, and the sheriff served her a subpoena for what I wanted. Guess she wasn't used to that. IT services for a client of mine. They paid for me to come to their office and address a problem 8 hours minimum time. The issue was resolved in about 45 minutes. They'd set up something incorrectly, and it was pretty obvious once I got into the system. I was packing up to leave, and the client stopped me. What are you doing? The system is fixed, so I'm headed out back to my office. No, I paid for 8 hours. You'll do your 8 hours. If I tell you to wash my car for 8 hours, that's what you'll be doing. Right, so anyway, I'm leaving. I'll notify the office to send you the invoice, and in all likelihood we'll no longer be working with you and withdrawing your lease on our equipment. I worked in management at a theater for a while. If the concession counter was slammed and I was able, I'd leave my post and help them sling popcorn. One night while helping out, a particularly belligerent man started cussing out a 16-year-old girl on a cash register for being too slow, even suggesting she quit, since she clearly couldn't handle pushing buttons or scooping popcorn. It was pretty disgusting, and I felt so bad for the girl. I stepped in and told the guy that our employees have the right to refuse service to customers who harass them as part of our anti-harassment/discrimination policy, empathized that the lines were longer than usual, and suggested he should apologize and move on. He was pissed, left half his order on the counter, and started fuming off. Anticipating his next move, I went back to my original post that night as manager of the customer service kiosk. Oh boy, the look on his face when he saw me. Didn't want a refund of his tickets though, so I assume he watched the movie without popcorn. That would be a customer we had named Nick. I'll leave his last name out to protect the stupid. He would email us and always CCEDITOR at SomeNationalNoWaspapa.com, and most of his emails were things like "nothing fucking works." None of the national newspapers responded. I imagine some underling just rolled his eyes and deleted them. Finally he said, "Fix this in 5 minutes or I cancel." My manager says, "Let me see that email." He responded, "Thank you, I cancelled your account. We don't want customers like you anyway. If you want to contact the media, that's your call. I'll happily provide the months of threatening emails you sent to my staff." He gave us months of headaches over a £45 quarter account. We definitely didn't need him. I wasn't good at returning library books when I was a kid. I got lectured by my school librarian about it a lot. Fast forward 20 years, and I'm a supervisor at the local public library, and my former now retired school librarian goes there. One day I see her sneaking around the front desk instead of coming back to say hi to me, and I immediately figure something's up. I go up to say hi, and she acts exasperated and tells me she was trying to avoid me because she had overdue books. So I put on my reading glasses, pulled them down over my nose, and delivered the same lecture she'd given me countless times about being responsible and turning in books on time. I was bartending one night and these 3 guys were absolutely hammered, so I cut them off. One of the guys proceeded to try to argue with me, saying he has all this money and he tells me when he's done drinking, and he's not even drunk. At this point, I'm done trying to be polite and point blank tell him I'm done arguing with him, will not be serving him and his buddies, and he can leave. He looks at me and says, "Now excuse me, who are you to tell me how much I can and cannot drink?" I look him dead in the eye and say, "The fucking bartender. Now it's time for you to go." The look on his face was priceless. Never forget the golden rule: don't piss off your bartender. I joined the Army Reserve in 1983, in between my junior and senior year in high school. Going to drill one weekend and we were doing war games with another reserve unit. They mailed everyone a letter with the challenge and response to be let into the unit. As a lowly private, I was standing guard at the entrance and had to say the challenge. Everything's going good until a city police car pulls up, and the cop is a new lieutenant. I give the challenge and he just look at me. I say it again, and he said to just let him in, because he didn't know it. He starts getting belligerent, and I ask him to turn off the car and step out. He gets out, and starts yelling at me. The sergeant major heard the commotion, and comes over, and hears the young lieutenant a new asshole. It was very satisfying to watch, and I learned that day that, even though a second lieutenant outranks a sergeant major, it really doesn't matter, because the sergeant major had been in for 20 years, and didn't put up with any bullshit. A few years ago a guy stopped me in the hardware store and asked if I was a painter. I looked down at my painter's whites and said, yeah, I do historical restoration work. He asked how much I charge per hour, and when I told him, he immediately told me I was too expensive and dropped my rate by 25%. I had already given him my number, but he kept belittling me and saying I wasn't worth it. I just told him that I already had a full-time job and this would be in my off hours, so it needed to be worth my while. He finally let me leave the store, then called me 3 or 4 times, each time hemming and hawing over if he wanted to actually use me or not. He's got a bunch of properties, it would be a sweet gig, but not at those prices. And I just kept telling him that's fine, don't use me if you don't want to. Eventually I recognized his number and stopped picking up. He really thought he had some sort of power over me and I'd jump at the opportunity. Luckily I didn't have to take the work, I was making good enough money as it was. He would have nitpicked absolutely everything and probably not paid me at the end anyway. But he was so certain he'd have power in the situation that he didn't seem able to comprehend me not wanting to barter with him. When an unhappy client threatens to go hire a better lawyer, they don't seem to get that this isn't a threat when they aren't paying me. I work in an NHS hospital. No one pays anything out of pocket for treatment here. It's all paid for through taxation. A patient was added onto our clinic who had paid one of our doctors for surgery privately at another hospital, but she was getting her follow-ups free on the NHS. Technically this shouldn't happen, but it does. These patients can be a bit difficult. This lady's appointment was at 8:55 before we even started at 9 o'clock. She had her workup done when we actually clocked in and was all snooty about waiting 5 whole minutes, bearing in mind she's saving a fortune. Then one of the nurses from the ward called and an actual NHS patient needed seen urgently, so they were brought up and seen ahead of the private patient. Well, this woman went mental, started shouting and bawling that she'd paid all this money and she demanded service. Our charge nurse went out, demanded to know who had taken money off of her, really drilled the patient to point to the person who had dared take money off of an NHS patient. Well, the woman went beetroot, stuttered that she had paid the other hospital and the charge was like, exactly, your money is no good here and doctor is being paid by the taxpayer to see this emergency patient first, so kindly sit down and be quiet or leave my department until you can be civil. I worked at a grocery store for 5 years putting up with crazy customers and their awful attitudes. At the end of my tenure our store was set to be closed, and for the last month the store was sold to a liquidation company. Meaning we were no longer under our parent company's umbrella and were no longer concerned with retaining customer loyalty. I got to tell customers no and respond with every bit of sarcasm and disdain to every Karen I encountered for 1 month until the store officially closed. I worked at a movie theater and some customers were adamant that a staff member had stolen their wallet after they dropped it. Turns out that these people just couldn't see and found the wallet once they actually looked for it. They got irate with literally everyone, from the mall security to the managers to the staff. Mall security finally said get the fuck out, and the customers went, you can't say that. This isn't your theater, we are customers. Mall security guy promptly said this is my mall and I can do whatever the fuck I want. Girl came into my apartment to hang out with my roommate. Demanded that I turn off the football game I was watching so we could focus on her. I literally said to her, who the hell do you think you are? And kept watching the game. She yelled at me and stormed out. Thankfully me and my roommate never saw her again.